Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, Episode 6. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today's guest is a retired hospice care administrator and family physician. He is the author of The Evolution Delusion, which is how I first learned about him. His newest book, A Purpose-Driven God, was released recently. He is passionate about Christian apologetics and wants to help others to see that the purpose of life is to glorify God and to help our fellow man. He's a member of the Southwest Church of Christ and has been married to his wife, Cherry, for over 50 years. Our guest today is Dr. Bo Kirkwood. Dr. Bo, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you guys.
Yeah. So what am I missing in the introduction? How do you usually talk to people if you're introducing yourself?
Pretty much the same. I'm a retired family physician of 36 years. I've been a Christian for most of my life. I became a Christian at age 16, and I'm 70 years old now. So I've been a Christian for a long time. I've had a long history of interest in the sciences, even as a young man. My favorite subjects in high school were biology and science oriented. And then, of course, I went on to go to medical school. And I was introduced very early to the idea of Christian apologetics as far as counteracting the theory of evolution. And since then, I've been active also in the intelligent design community as far as showing that there has to be an intelligence behind the universe. And that intelligence, of course, would be God. And then incorporating that into my Christian belief, because intelligent design is only part of the puzzle. Then you have to decide who that intelligent designer is. And I believe very firmly that it's God and Jesus Christ. And so, no, I've been doing this for a while, and I'm passionate about it. I enjoy talking about it. And we could go for hours, but this podcast won't last that long. But I can go for hours talking about this, and I really enjoy doing it. Hence the reason I've written my books that I've written.
Yeah, that's good. So you go from becoming a Christian at 16, and now you've had several books that you've written. Were you raised in the church and always was around that, or was there something that happened at 15 or 16 where you came to believe? Like, what would the story be from a young person to where you've gotten to now as an apologist?
Yeah, a good question. My family, my mother and dad were Christians. They were introduced to the church where I grew up in when I was like 9 years old, which was at that time Red Bluff Church of Christ. And they were introduced to that church by our family physician, Dr. Curtis Torno, who persuaded them to check it out, so to speak. And they became members of that church. And then I grew up there and was taught in Bible class like a lot of young men, and listened to many a sermon by Luther Blackman and Ralph Williams and other preachers that came along the way. I felt like I needed to make the decision to be a Christian on my own and find reason for doing that. A lot of my friends in church became Christians early on, at 12, 13, 14. At 16, I actually thought I was coming in very late, but that's when I finally decided to give my life for Christ, and I haven't turned back. But getting into the sciences, I realized that there were some apparent contradictions between science and the Bible. And I started asking questions, and men like Dr. Curtis Torno and other men of the church, like Alva White, who was an elder there, as well as Don Carter, my future father-in-law, started pointing me in directions and letting me understand that no, science doesn't contradict the Bible. The Bible doesn't contradict science. Sometimes our interpretation of the Bible may seem to contradict science and vice versa, but the Bible is always going to be true. And if we have a problem with science and the Bible, it's probably our understanding of what either lies behind the science, and evolution is a so-called science because it's nothing of the sort. It's a theory or a philosophy, but it's not scientific at all. At least macroevolution isn't. And when I began to see that, then I could reason that there was no reason for me to shun becoming a part of the, quote, scientific community, although I don't know. I don't guess being a doctor is being scientific necessarily, but going that route, and more I was finding other people that felt the same way, and hence got into apologetics.
Okay, so would you say that you felt like there was a conflict or contradiction? Is that high school or is that
Yes,
as you're going into college?
high school mostly, and I took a class called Biology 2 in particular, and it was for people that were likely or wanting to go into some part of biology or healthcare or something after high school. It was an advanced class, but the two teachers in that class taught evolution, and I'll never forget one of them, Mr. Collins. They were very influential in my life, and they were very passionate teachers of the sciences. But Mr. Collins began the lectures on evolution by just stating, evolution is a scientific fact, period. It's a scientific fact. Well, when it came time to take our test on that subject, I argued with him about it. And to his credit, he tried to answer my arguments. I didn't think very well, but he tried to answer my arguments, and he didn't put me down for believing what I believed. Fast forward into the University of Houston, where I did my undergraduate work in biology, and I took a course called Evolution and Population Genetics. I wanted to learn more about evolution. When I got in the course, one of the first things the professor said is, you need to throw the theory of evolution out of the scientific window because it is not science. Now, to hear that from a scientist was remarkable. And he was talking about macroevolution. He said macroevolution is a philosophy. It is not science. And I had really never heard that from a top level PhD credentialed scientist before. And I don't know if he was a Christian or not, but it really started making me think, okay, now we really need to delve into this theory of evolution even more. And more and more I began to understand it wasn't scientific at all. It was philosophical. But I remained a Christian during those times, but everyone has questions. And the temptation was to try to bring evolution, like you said, into religion. Theistic evolution is the term for it now. The problem with that is there's no scientific evidence for it. That's the biggest problem. The biggest problem with theistic evolution is there's no scientific evidence for it. And the second problem is now, you're going to throw away a lot of Bible when you start doing that. It's beginning in the book of Genesis. And so I am not a theistic evolutionist, really never was, but I understand what their attempt was, but it's a failed attempt, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you'll hear people today. It's interesting what that professor said, because you will hear people today, particularly evolutionists, that say you really can't understand biology unless you understand macroevolution. Basically, they don't use the term macroevolution, but that's what they say, evolution, and that's what they mean.
Oh,
How do you respond to that?
Yeah, you're quoting directly from them. I forget who said it, but one said, good science cannot be practiced without the theory of evolution. Nonsense. That's never been true. Good science has been practiced without accepting the theory of evolution, and good science continues to be practiced without accepting the theory of evolution. That's just a nonsensical statement by a materialist, a natural materialist who doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in the supernatural. And so he can say that, but it's not true. And all you got to do is go back and look at Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell and Johann Kepler and all those great scientists of the 17th, 18th centuries and before that were strong believers in God. Now, was evolution a theory back then? No, I grant you it wasn't, but I don't believe any one of those people would have accepted evolution as scientific either, because they would have seen right through it. You cannot prove it scientifically. It is an unproven theory. I would even argue, as Josh Gertler does, who's also a PhD credential and a Christian as well, and that evolution doesn't even rise to the level of a theory. It's more philosophy. It's not even a good scientific theory. And again, we're talking about macroevolution. No one that I know of really doubts microevolution, and that's adaptation. species changed, and that's a given. The elephants today look different than the elephants did 1,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. We can go down the list. That's not evolution. That's adaptation, and it's not what Darwin was trying to prove in his book. That is that species can turn into different species. I'd rather use the word kind, because species is a human term, and there are many species of bird, finches, for example, but they're all finches and they're all birds. So they're still the same kind. And kinds don't turn into other kinds. We don't see it in the fossil record. We certainly don't see it going on today.
Yeah. So if somebody's listening to this and they're hearing you say that this really isn't science, it's really a philosophy, but they've been told their entire life, maybe starting in biology class like you were, that no, this is true and it's a fact and you must believe this or you can't really do good science. What is your approach to simply say, hey, there are these previous scientists? Like if you were talking to somebody who wants to do science, but they feel like they have to believe this way, what is your approach
I
to
would tell
talking to
them to
someone like that?
study. Most people accept evolution, unless they're going into evolutionary science. Most people and most scientists that accept evolution simply accept it because it is the current accepted scientific dogma. They haven't looked at it. They haven't examined it really closely to see the science behind it. And the pure scientists, especially people that are mathematicians and so forth, that really look at the hard science behind evolution, will find there isn't any. So the first thing I would tell them is don't just accept it. Don't take my word for it. And I could refer them to many different sources to help them do that. Stephen Meyer is probably one of the best. He's written many books: The Signature in the Cell, the Return of the God Hypothesis, Darwin's Doubt. I would certainly refer them to someone like Michael Behe, who wrote Darwin's a Black Box, and the Darwin's Delusion, for example. Those are excellent scientific books. They're not spiritual books. They're not religious books at all. Although I would say those men are consider themselves religious people. That's not in their books. They look at it from a scientific point of view. Douglas Axe is another one. And just the idea of where proteins could come, how could proteins possibly come together randomly? Douglas Axe, that's his specialty, if you will. And so I would refer them to look at the theory scientifically. Just look at it scientifically. And if they do that with an open mind, I think they will find the same thing as that I found growing up. The other thing is if evolution were true, and this is one that doesn't get talked about a lot, but the fossil record should be replete with transitional forms. If you've got different kinds becoming new kinds, they don't do that. Even the evolutionists would say they don't do that overnight. It just doesn't happen overnight. A dog doesn't become a polar bear overnight. That may be an absurd example, but it just doesn't happen. So where are those transitional forms? They're not there. They're just not there. They give a few examples, and they have to really fit in a lot of missing pieces to the puzzle. And the two that come to mind are Eohippus, the horse, and the new one now is the whale. When I was growing up, whales came out of the water to become mammals. Now it's the other way around. Whales have become whales by mammals coming out of the land and onto the water. Now, an evolutionist cannot tell you why they would want to do that. But when you look at the evidence behind those limited, very, very limited examples of transitional forms, you'll find that they're flawed. And the deal is there should be a lot more of those. And so the fossil record doesn't prove evolution, and the science doesn't prove evolution.
Yeah, I mean, all of those are good points. I think it's interesting how one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the mechanism that they say is of. So I guess usually it's this neo-Darwinian sense of there were these mutations that there were some good ones somehow, and they created these new features, and those features accumulate to be good over time. Could you talk a little bit about maybe that the math or the probability behind that type of thing? I guess, I mean, what you're saying about Douglas Axe is probably related to that, but just this idea of the mechanism for all of this is mutations, and
Well, and
it's not
there's
clear.
sort of the problem. First of all, natural selection and survival of the fittest is what you're talking about.
Hmm.
But here's the problem: natural selection and survival of the fittest assumes an animal to begin with. You can't have natural selection or survival of the fittest if you don't have an animal of some sort to begin with. So the evolutionists first have to prove where life began from. It's called origin of life, and there are origin of life experiments that are currently going on throughout the world. They have been severely, uh, they haven't been successful. They've been severely unsuccessful. And there's a fellow by the name of Dr. James Tour of Rice University, who is um, how does he put himself? He's a Jewish Christian. He grew up in the Jewish religion, although not a real faithful Jew, practicing Jew, but became a Christian. He is a nanoscientist. He's extremely bright. Should have won probably some Nobel Prizes by now, but hasn't, I think, maybe because of his religious beliefs. But he is in a number of inventions. And he's looked at all the origin of life experiments that have been going on since 1953 or whenever, not that late, early, but when the early Miller-Urey experiment came out. And he has shown that they have all been dramatic failures. So we can't produce life in a test tube, even when we add our own intelligence to it. Now, maybe we will someday, but we haven't come close to it now. So let's go now back to natural selection and survival of the fittest. William Dembski, who was a mathematician, wrote a book years ago called The Design Inference. And he looked at the probability of life beginning randomly from a mathematics standpoint. And the number, and I don't have it at the top of my head, but it's something like 10 to the minus 150th power, which, if we have any mathematicians out there, is an astronomical number. If the universe were trillions of years old, would not be enough time for that to occur. Trillions of years old. And then let's fast forward to Michael Behe once again, who, after he wrote Darwin's Black Box, which talked about irreducible complexity, which we can talk about later, but he looked at the idea of, can mutations really cause species to change? And he wrote a book called Darwin's Delusion. No, Darwin Devolves. Let me get the name of the book right. Darwin Devolves. What he found was mutations do cause change and adaptation. That's how we adapt. That's how species adapt. But when that occurs, you don't get an increase in information, you get a decrease in information. So adaptation actually causes a decrease in information. And for evolution to occur, you have to have an increase in information, not a decrease. And you can sort of see that in the domestic world. I'll use dogs, for example. Dogs are part of the canine kind. I believe they're related to wolves, coyotes, jackals, things of that nature. But they have been domesticated and they have been adapted and they have changed. And now you have everything from a Labrador to a Chihuahua to everything in between. But they have done that adaptation and manipulation by loss of genetic material, not increase in genetic material. And I ask you, which would survive longer in the wild, my pet Labrador or a coyote? I think the obvious answer is the coyote will. And so when adaptation occurs, sometimes it is beneficial, won't deny that. Sometimes adaptation is beneficial. That's why adaptation occurs. You can look at bears, for example. There's a reason polar bears are white and they live up in the north. You don't see a polar bear in the south because white blends in with the snow and is better for catching prey and so forth. But they're still bears. And they have lost genetic material to get to that point. And Behe, in particular, uses the bear as an example, the polar bear as an example. So all those mechanisms don't add up to evolution, macroevolution, changes in kinds. They just don't.
Yeah. So yeah, I want to get to some more of the science part later, but I do want to kind of circle back and think about worldview a little bit, because the question can arise, okay, if this is such a bad, I don't even like to call it a theory either. I'd rather call it a
Yes,
hypothesis, and it's not really even a good hypothesis. But if it's
philosophy.
so poor, how is it this prevailing view? How could that happen when there's if the emperor has no clothes? Like, how does something like this happen? That
Be-
all
be-
of these people that are scientists are going along with it.
Yeah, Richard Lowenton's put it very succinctly, because we have a priority of belief, and he's an evolutionist, by the way, a priority of belief that can't let a divine nature in the door. And so that speaks to the worldview. You know, everybody has a worldview. I think most people don't go around thinking about what their worldview is. The majority of people wouldn't be able to articulate it if you ask them. You go on the streets of Houston, Texas, or Huntsville, Alabama, or anywhere, and ask them what a person's worldview is, they're going to scratch their head and look at you like, what's wrong with you? But they do have a worldview. They just haven't articulated or thought about it. And there are two, I would say, primary worldviews. There's a lot of worldviews, but they're all subcategories of two primary worldviews. One is a materialistic worldview, and that's where most scientists fall into natural materialism, methodological materialism, whatever word you want to call it. But it believes that everything has to occur by naturalistic forces, and that everything that we see around us, our universe, the biological world, our beings, humankind included, all came about purely by random chance, that there is no such thing as an afterlife. We're here, we die, and it's all over. There's nothing left afterwards. Nothing is here by any type of special creation or supernatural means. That's the materialistic worldview. And when you hold that worldview, what are you left with? Right now, you're left with evolution, you're left with multi-universe, you're left with all kind of speculative theories. The other worldview is, I would call it, a theistic worldview. And a theistic worldview, that's where intelligent design comes in. And the theistic worldview says, wait a second, I see a lot of design in the universe. There's a lot of fine tuning that's gone on for us to be here. And by the way, even the materialists don't deny that. They see that there's fine tuning. If the speed of light isn't what it is, if the gravitational force isn't what it is, if the electromagnetic forces were not what they are, so on and so forth. There's many of them. Then we couldn't be here. Well, the theistic point of view sees that and sees design and its purpose, and can understand that why could there not have been something supernatural, if you will, that could have occurred at the beginning by a divine being who transcends time, transcends anything our human minds can possibly imagine, and that being would be God. And those are your two those are your two worldviews. And if you hold the materialistic worldview, you're not going to let anything supernatural or divine in that door, and you can't let it in. And so, as we speak right now, evolution is the thing, and it may have permutations. There's all kinds of new evolutionary theories and neo-Darwinism. There's others beyond that. Punctuational equilibrium, where they try to explain how kinds can jump from one kind very quickly, but there's just no evidence for that. But they're always trying to explain it from a materialistic point of view.
Yeah. So you mentioned the multiverse while you were talking about that. I thought that was interesting because my nephew, I don't know how much you know about comic books, but like
It's very
there's
popular.
there's this new Spider-Man, and
Oh yeah,
he's in the multiverse, and so there are different Spider-Man in each multiverse, and like there's a girl Spider-Man, and then there are these different ethnic Spider-Man, and it seems that that's a thing that's an idea that's kind of pushed in popular culture and maybe even to kids. And I was wondering what evidence, if any, have you seen of this idea of a multiverse? Where is this coming from? What do we say when someone says, well, there could be this multiverse?
well, you're right. First of all, you're exactly right. It's very popular. Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, and I'm not picking on him, but he's everybody knows who he is, and he accepts the multiverse. He even goes a step further and says that we may be living in a matrix. Okay, we may be living in a big computer, which is really far out. Multiverse, in my opinion, You didn't hear about it 50 years ago, okay? When I was going through high school and so forth, we didn't talk about a multiverse. But when the Big Bang Theory was postulated, and then someone like Stephen Hawking comes around and tries to prove the Big Bang, instantly Stephen Hawking realized he had a problem. And that is, if there's a Big Bang, that means there is a beginning of the universe. Now, I'm not proposing a Big Bang mechanism for how the universe began, but we have to admit, even if we're Christians, there was a big something that occurred at the beginning. Something big occurred, but the point is, it had a beginning. The universe had a beginning, and the book of Genesis says that in the beginning, it had a beginning. Well, something that has a beginning has a cause, universally. When something has a beginning, it has to have a cause. Hawking realized that very early on and said, hold on then, wait a second. I've just proven there's a God because I proved there's a Big Bang, which therefore had to have a cause. And so what theories that he started looking for immediately was a theory of how to explain all that away. And bam, we get the multiverse. There is absolutely, and so what a multiverse says, and it's a way of trying to explain away that fine tuning we talked about. That's what multiverse really is. We know it's fine tuned, but we can't explain why it's fine tuned. Well, if there's an infinite number of universes, and that's what multiverse says, that there's an infinite number of multiverses, then there had to be one universe that we find ourselves in now. That's multiverse. There's no proof for it at all. Stephen Hawking came up with some mathematical equations using imaginary numbers, but that's not proof. There's nothing, and it would be impossible to prove because you can't see outside your own universe anyway. It's an impossible theory. It encompasses too much. And when you have a theory that encompasses that much, you have a theory that really doesn't explain really anything. Right. And so you have to start relating to that. So in my opinion, multiverse, it's a popular theory because it's an explanation of really trying to explain why our universe is so finely tuned. But there's no proof for it, and nor do I think there ever will be. But it's a fanciful thing. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson also said there's probably a universe where Elvis Presley is still alive, for example. You know, and it's fun to think of those things. Even I catch myself thinking about things like that before, but I don't think there's multi-universes. And here's the other problem: the multi-universe. It really doesn't solve the problem for scientists anyway. If you had multi-universe, you would have to have a multi-universe machine. Something would have to be out there popping out these multi-universes like popcorn. Stephen Meyer says that multi-universe machine, which they use multi-universe inflationary theory to explain, would require even more exquisite fine-tuning than even our present universe requires. So you're back to square one. Where did the fine-tuning come for that multi-universe machine? It doesn't really help, but no, there's no proof for it. It is I like to call it fanciful theory, but it does make popular movies. There's movies been out about it. There's comic books, like you say, and there's any number of books that like to discuss the multi-universe.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'm somewhat afraid of is that we could possibly have something similar to, I think in the past it was like this with dinosaurs, where dinosaurs were used in things with kids to kind of smuggle in this old Earth idea and some of the ideas that are fundamental to trusting in something like evolution. So that's just the thing I'm kind of
it's a concern, but what people that, I mean, most kids don't care about the theory of multiverse. They like the speculation. But once again, as we go back to evolution, there's got to be some science behind it. And other than some sort of made up equations using imaginary numbers, I don't know if you know what imaginary numbers are. You probably do, but it's hard for me to get my mind around that. You know, I can't buy it. Now, there's a big difference, of course, between dinosaurs and multiverse. We have dinosaur skeletons. I grew up where some people want to deny that dinosaurs ever existed. It's going to be hard to do that. When you've got skeletal remains, I don't think there's a big conspiracy theory out there that are planting these dinosaur remains throughout the world. I think they're real. I've seen dinosaur tracks personally in dinosaur skeletons and so forth. Now, In fact, you could go up into Mount St. Helens, where that explosion occurred in the 1980s, and see trilobites all over the place, which are basically old dinosaurs. So no, dinosaurs existed. We have to have a way of explaining them, whether you use young Earth or old Earth mechanism, but it doesn't prove evolution at all.
Yeah,
The
that's
same
a good
problem with
point.
dinosaurs you'd have with any animal. That where's the transitional forms? Once again, they're not there.
Right. So yeah, like if you look at the science, it's fine, but there can be a tendency from some believers that if you take something like dinosaurs and you associate it with the evolution, then well, then dinosaurs must not exist because I want to believe in God. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because there are people that would say that to not believe in evolution, you must be a conspiracy theorist. You must believe that the Earth is flat. That you must that there are. And how do we as believers make sure that we're not saying, "Hey, I'm just going to not pay any attention to the science because some things get associated with things that are actually pseudoscience." How do
Yeah, but we're
we?
not. That's the deal. Is we're not.
Right.
There's very intelligent scientists going that are actively involved in research right now that is design oriented and showing that there's more. You can prove a lot more by showing there's design behind something than not. And there's no reason. Some people think that as science progresses, the more and more it's going to prove evolution and prove there is no God. I look at it exactly the opposite. And I think more and more scientists are seeing it this way too. The more we learn scientifically, the more it proves there's an intelligence behind the universe. It's exactly the opposite. There's no reason for Christians, in my opinion, to shun science whatsoever. But you've got people like yourself. I mean, when I was in medical school, I would say the majority of my friends were not. They believed in evolution. They may have been religious, but they wanted to try to marry their religion with evolution. And when I gave them my thoughts concerning the topic, you know what the answer was, or what their response was? They had never heard those arguments before. They hadn't been given to them, and I at least made them think. I don't know if I won anyone over or not, but some of my best friends, I made them think about it. They'd never thought about it. What do you mean transitional forms? What does that mean? But do you realize? Well, they'd been taught they had all these transitional forms everywhere, and it just wasn't true. And so, no, there's no reason for young scientists at all to be fearful of evolution because there's no science behind it. So you have to be careful. I understand that as a scientist, and I wasn't a part of that academic world where I relied on tenure and that sort of thing. Scientists have lost their jobs purporting intelligent design theories. Guillermo Gonzalez being a prime example of it, but there's been others as well. But I think that's about to change. I think there's something on the horizon, and you know why I say that? I'm starting to see more and more scientists debate people of the intelligent design community, and they used to wouldn't even debate them. They wouldn't even debate them. And now you're seeing people like Stephen Meyer and others, William Dembski and others, get involved in those debates with scientists. And the scientists are more willing to now to at least take a look at the intelligent design concept.
Yeah, I think that's that I'm seeing more of that too. People are at least willing to go to at least listen because you can immediately be called names or something like that or
Oh
being
yeah,
unscientific when it's actually the exact opposite. That
yeah. I mean,
it's
there's fellows like John Lennox in the. I don't know if you know who John Lennox is, but
Mhm.
John Lennox, you do. Mathematician out of Northern Ireland. I think he was Oxford trained. Very brilliant man. I mean, can't deny his intelligence. Strong believer. And he articulates his position a lot better than I can articulate my position, probably. But you look at a man like that and you can see he's not a stupid man. He's mathematician. To me, that means a lot. When you've got a PhD in mathematics, you have to be pretty smart. It's one of the harder sciences. And yet he's a strong believer in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He's a strong believer that those miracles that occurred during the first century, and yet he can articulate it very well. And he hasn't had to give up a thing to do that.
Yeah, that's good. So speaking of mathematics, sometimes mathematics is called the language of God. Can you talk a little bit about what people mean by that and how, as believers, we can see God in math?
Yes, I've got a couple of chapters in my book, A Purpose-Driven God, on that, and you'll see that because it's kind of new to me as well. But when Stephen Meyer came out with his book, The God Hypothesis, he gave 3 reasons for there to be a God from a scientific point of view. A mathematician read his book and he said, "You left out one," and that was mathematics. He didn't include mathematics in his God Hypothesis book, Return of the God Hypothesis. I think he's going to now when he writes more books. But Isaac Newton, probably one of the most brilliant minds ever to walk this earth from a human standpoint, was a mathematician, as you know, and was the inventor of calculus. By the way, he was co-inventor. Calculus was invented by another fellow too, at the same time on a different continent. Think about that. What that tells you is calculus was not really invented by either one of those individuals. Right. It was discovered by those individuals. Calculus was already embedded in the fabric of the universe, just like 2 + 2 = 4 is already embedded in the fabric of the universe. So I would rather call Isaac Newton a discoverer of the calculus, not an inventor. But Newton looked at the world and he could see that the world could be explained mathematically. The theory of gravity, his theories of the laws of motion and so forth, all those could be explained by mathematical equations. Mathematics implies logic. Mathematics, therefore, implies a mind. Sounds as stupid as it may sound, 2 + 2 doesn't have to equal 4, okay? The Pythagorean theory doesn't have to be true, okay? Those things don't have to be true. And then as time went by, more and more started seeing that as well. Even before Isaac Newton, by a few decades, was Johann Kepler, which we've already just talked about here. Johann Kepler, who's one who coined the word language of God, he said mathematics was the language of God. It's the way in which God expresses order in the universe. And the fact that we can use mathematics to, for example, let's say send a rocket ship to the moon and get it back safely with people on board. The reason we can do those things and the laws of physics are what they are is because there has to be a logic, a supreme logic behind it all. And hence mathematics is, in my opinion, one of the proofs of God. It doesn't have to be that way. And, we talk about the 2 primary theories that permeate physics today that have stood the test with time, and that is relativity and quantum theory, quantum mechanics. Well, relativity doesn't have to be true, but every experiment we've ever done so far has failed to disprove relativity. And not to get into any great detail, and I certainly don't propose to know everything there is to know about relativity, even less about quantum mechanics. The point is, you can't eat a sandwich on an airplane going 500 miles an hour across the globe without getting smacked in the face if it wasn't for relativity, because that's what Einstein said. The physics is the same in uniform motion. The physics is the same anywhere in the universe, and that allows chemical reactions to occur in the universe. The same chemical reactions that are occurring on Earth today would be the same chemical reactions that would be occurring on Mars or Jupiter or anywhere else chemical reactions could occur. And that's because there's an order behind the universe, a mathematical, logical order behind the universe. And all the mathematical equations that we have derived today are really not coming from the mind of man. Man had to discover them, but they were already there. And I think put there for a reason. God has given man the intellect to be able to discover these things, including relativity and quantum mechanics. He's given us the ability to discover these things. And I believe personally that is one way in which we are created in the image of God. And I think Kepler believed that too. He looked at the idea of the image of God that we're clearly told we're created in. That's not that God has eyes and ears and a mouth and arms and legs. That's not the image that we are created in as far as God is concerned. It's our intellect. It's our ability to have free will, the ability to decide to do right or wrong, the ability to follow God or not follow God. We don't have to do that. Like you said, you're in the robotic world. God, if he had chosen to, could have created a robotic universe that was purely mechanical, where everything just did exactly the way he set it up to be. He didn't do it that way. I will have to ask him that when I get there, but he didn't do it that way. He gave mankind free will. He also gave free will, apparently, to Satan as well. And the angelic beings that we read about in the Old Testament and New Testament, they had free will as well. I digress a little bit there, but the point is the mathematics that we can study, and there's mathematics that we still don't even know about. I truly believe that. But as we study them, we'll see that they're logical. They form a logical sequence of events. And if it weren't so, we couldn't do science today.
Yeah. So you mentioned us being made in the image of God, and you talked about how the intellect is part of that, but also the free will and the ability to choose right from wrong. So as far as I can tell, one of the weak points of atheism is this idea of morality, where there's no reason to be a moral or upright person. Not that a person that's atheistic isn't moral or upright in some way, but it seems that they would have to borrow that from a sense of God. Can you talk a little bit about it? And would you say that how would I put this? Is a moral atheist, is that because they are made in the image of God? Is that why it is? Because they would often say something like, this is the best way to do things, to treat people with love and with dignity and with respect, and that's why I do it. And we just understand that that's the way things should be. But it doesn't seem that would line up with an atheistic worldview or a materialistic worldview.
And it doesn't seem that. And again, I would like to iterate what you just said. Just because someone is an agnostic or atheist doesn't make them immoral people. In fact, I've got people close to me that are agnostic that are some of the most moral people you'll ever meet in your life, willing to help individuals and do what's right. And they have that sense of right or wrong, but I would ask them, where did they get it? Moral relativism is the theory of the day. Okay. Moral relativism says how we determine what's moral is how society defines morality. Friend, that gets you into problems real quick, because when you start letting society determine what's morally right and morally wrong, that's when you get into situations like we had 70 years ago in Nazi Germany, where millions of people were put to death because they were of a certain a religious belief, or they were abnormal in some way. And society allowed that because of this idea of moral relativism. We see it in our society today when it comes to abortion. Sadly to say, I think if you were to do a poll of the American public today, the majority, maybe not the vast majority, but a majority, over 50%, would agree at least in some form of abortion, early term be it, but still abortion. That doesn't make it right. God, I think, has put morality in our hearts. There's a certain basic morality that we have, and that was there at the beginning of mankind. You know, Adam and Eve didn't live under the Ten Commandments, neither did Cain and Abel. But yet Cain and Abel knew they had a moral law etched in their hearts, and I believe that has to come from someone else, and it has to come from God. Otherwise, there would be no real reason to act morally if it wasn't there. Who's to say then what's good and what's bad? Society does, if you're a moral relativist, and that is a poor way of looking at things. But if you pin down the materialist, if you really pin them down, they have to say that they really can't define right and wrong very well without deferring to the basic morality that we're born with. And moral relativism, oh man, it's bad, and but that's where we're headed. That's the kind of world we live in. So we're going to decide as human beings what's morally right or morally wrong, and hopefully you don't live in a society where having red hair is considered, I'll just use that as an example, is a morally wrong thing to have, and it's okay to destroy them. That's why we have people like Peter Singer, who is supposed to be a medical ethicist, who can say that personhood doesn't begin till an individual is at least 2 years of age. And before that, they're not even a person. And so he would have no qualms at all with taking a newborn who has some sort of physical defect and destroying that newborn after birth. But we have full-term abortions even right now. What's the difference? Or at least in some areas. So yes, I don't believe in the idea of moral relativism. I think that is a road that's going to get us down a path of that Satan would love for us to go, to be quite blunt about it. But there's a moral code. I think that's instinctive to all of us. And our patriarchs, Abraham, and all those people that lived before the Mosaic Law was even written in tablets of stone originally in the Ten Commandments, they had a law. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because they were sinful. Well, how did they know they were sinful if there was no written law? Because there was a law. It was a patriarchal law, but it was a law written in their heart. So things such as murder, thievery, rape, things of that nature are morally wrong in all societies. You see that in all societies. No society condones those things. And I think that comes from God.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with all of that. All of these ideas, or a lot of these ideas, are in the book that you just published. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and why this book, A Purpose-Driven God? Like I said, I've got your book, The Evolution Delusion, right here. That's where I first came in contact with you. But why this book? Why now? Was there something that kind of burning in you that you said, I got to get this book out? What was
Well,
it?
some of it was what I'm seeing going on in our world today. I look around and I see, the identity issue that we have, whether or not you can be a man, a woman, or a cat, I guess, if you want to be, could call yourself that or anything else. And I see where our society is headed. We see what's just happened over in Israel, for example, where now Hamas, can you imagine in our capital yesterday, there were people that saying we're praising Hamas, which killed thousands of people in unprovoked. And now seeing things like that, although my book was written before those things, well, it wasn't finished before then, but I started it before then. And so I was seeing those sorts of things, and I didn't deal with those things in my other book. My other book was more about evolution. There's a little bit of evolution in this book, but that's not the thrust of it. Then I read what Peter said when he said that we have to be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us to every man. And that means the atheist, the agnostic, the believer, to every man. My book is an answer to Peter, if you want to call it that. And so my book begins, and if I've had a criticism in my book, it's because it's very sciencey, if you want to use that word, at the very beginning. There's a lot of science in it. I look at the anatomy of the human body, especially the cardiac and respiratory systems that we have. I look at the plant world, the biological world, even photosynthesis. I think it's important to look at those things. How did that start randomly? And so I do take a deep dive in some of those things, and I do mathematics. I talk about the Mandelbrot set and so on. But the last 3 chapters of my book, I call the meat of my book. So if you think those are too sciencey, skip over them and go to the last 3 chapters. If you're anyone, you're not going to do that. But I'm talking about anyone in your audience. But I would say, don't get hung up on the mathematic equations, because I don't even understand some of them. Just delve through it, but they're not. It's not that sciencey. But that has been a little bit of a criticism. But you get through that and get to the last 3 or 4 chapters of the book. And then I get to the heart of the book. And it's one thing to believe that there's an intelligence behind the universe, but that doesn't save you. That doesn't get my soul into heaven. It just doesn't. Jesus said there's only one way, and that's through him. Nobody comes to the Father except by him. So the rest of my book is identifying the designer of the universe. And the Gospel of John tells you who that is. In the very first chapter, it says the Word was with God and the Word was God, and through everything it came from the Word. Everything came from the Word. Who was that Word? It's Jesus Christ. And I show that. And then people want to say Christians have a blind faith. And I don't believe that. Most Christians don't. There's some that do. You talk about being raised in the church. That's the problem sometimes with being quote unquote raised in the church, because you've never questioned your faith. You were taught that from a young pup. And so you were a Christian almost from the get-go, although we understand there had to be an age of accountability that occurred. But then at that point, you've got to prove that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Just one thing to say it and believe it, and that's important to do. But God doesn't expect us to have a blind faith. There is eyewitnesses to Jesus Christ. They are recorded. There's both secular eyewitnesses and there are eyewitnesses that became his apostles and his disciples and members of the church, of his church, which was established in the book of Acts. Well, those people, for the most part, went to their deaths believing what they believed, and many of them went to their deaths very brutally. So either they saw the risen Savior or they didn't. But would you go to your death believing a lie? That makes sense, does it? So I believe those eyewitnesses. Peter says we were eyewitnesses. We were eyewitnesses. He seen and he touched Jesus Christ himself. And not just Peter, but again, Paul said there was at least 500 people that were alive when he wrote his epistle that were around that had seen the risen Savior. So now and once you take that into consideration, then the rest of the Old Testament becomes absolutely the Word of God, because Jesus quoted from it. He quoted repeatedly from it. He fulfilled prophecies from it. And that's another way of, quote unquote, proving that he was the Son of God, is the fulfillment of prophecy, most of which he could not have chosen to do. They just happened and they occurred as they did. And so once that's established, then you've got his word as the written word of God. And I have to make a choice now. I'm either going to obey it or I'm going to ignore it. And of course, I make the case for obedience. And I don't shy away from that in my book. Intelligent design, as I have said in my press release to some of the newspapers and radio stations that my press release have gone out to, intelligent design gets you to the goal line. It doesn't get you to the end zone. It doesn't get you there. It has to be Jesus Christ that does it through belief in him, through repentance, through confession. And yes, I even delve into baptism, because my book talks about how most of the religious world wants to avoid, for some reason, they want to avoid baptism. James Tour, I love the man. I've met him. I've talked about him already. He's an evangelist as well as a chemist of renowned importance, but doesn't believe that one has to be baptized to be saved. And I've questioned him on that. I don't understand that, but I make a case for that in my book as well. And then I think I make a case for why we need to stand up for what we believe. We no longer need to be on the sidelines, in my opinion. We can't let what's going around in the world. I don't mean we have to become protesters and start marching on Washington, D.C. or our local courthouses, although that's okay to do. But we need to be advocates for Christ. And we are lights. I talk about that in my book as well. We are lights of the world. Jesus said that. We are lights of the world. How are we lights of the world? By the lives that we live. And if we can't be faithful to Jesus, and important too, in my book, I talk about this as well. Sometimes as Christians, I forget the second part of the great commandment. It's not just to love God, but who else is it to love? My neighbor. And Jesus tells us who our neighbor is. And it's not necessarily just my fellow Christian. You know, the Good Samaritan parable is clear about that. I need to be willing to help all people, not just those that agree with me religiously or philosophically, but I need to be willing to help all people. And maybe by doing that, they will see the light that's shining in my life, and become Christians as a result. That's the reason for the book. Okay. And I know of at least one atheist that's read my book. And I'll tell you how I know that, because she interviewed me from the United Kingdom. Very pleasant lady, but clearly not a believer. And she was very courteous. But she told me after the interview was over, and I could tell while the interview was going on, she wasn't a believer. But she said when she was raised growing up, she was unlike me. She was raised in a family that did not believe in God. In fact, her father told them, you can believe what you want to when you grow up, but in this family, we're not going to church, and we're not going to introduce the Bible to you or any other religious concept for that matter. Sad thing, but that's what we see happening in the world today. And we see it more and more, where people that actually grew up in a Christian home, quote unquote, Christian home, are now longer not believers in God at all. And that to me is extremely sad. Again, hence the reason for the book.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I'm going to start winding it up because we're almost out of time for you. But
Sure.
you mentioned baptism, of course, and you mentioned age of accountability. I was talking to a young man. He's about to turn 13 in a few weeks, I think, and he was asking me about that. And you're a former elder. You're a member of the church, been so for several decades. How do you talk to a young person about age of accountability type questions when they're thinking about becoming a Christian? What would you, how do you
Well,
approach that
first of all,
question?
in that young man's case, if he's asking about it, he's there. If he's asking about it, he's got enough intelligence and enough maturity to be there. I think the age of accountability is one thing the Bible clearly doesn't define that I know of, but I believe it means when, first of all, we know right from wrong. That isn't enough. A little 5-year-old may know right from wrong in certain things. That still doesn't make them at an age of accountability. They have to be at an age where they understand Jesus Christ, what it means to be the Son of God. They need to be able to understand that concept as best as we human beings can. And when they reach that level where they understand that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, came to this earth to live a perfect life and die for our sins voluntarily, and was resurrected from the dead, they're able at that point. I believe they're at the age of accountability. And I don't know in the long stream of things how that's going to ferret out with God, but I think it can be different for different children. I have seen 10-year-olds obey the gospel. Make you wonder, but maybe they were at that level. I don't know. But as an elder, I would ask them those questions I just articulated. And if they can answer those questions, and they're at that age. But I think it differs. 11 or 12 certainly seems like it's getting close to that age. I clearly at 16 was past that age. I think I waited a little bit too long. Maybe I was hard-headed and needed a little bit more reinforcement. I'm not sure. I was not a bad kid. I think I was obedient to my parents and those things, but I just wasn't ready. I wasn't ready till age 16. And thankfully, the Lord granted me those years to make it to that age so that I could obey the gospel at that age. But it's not an easy question. But I think if a person's asking those questions that 13-year-old was asking, they're there.
Yeah. Yeah. He may be watching this, so we'll see. But
Okay.
hopefully by the time he's watching this, he's probably made that decision. So
Hopefully this
I
helps
think
a
he's
little bit.
close. Yeah. Hopefully that
Hopefully
helps.
this helps. It's
Yeah.
the best decision anybody can ever make in their life. If you want meaning or purpose in your life, because materialist has no purpose. If all you're here is to take up space and breathe air and then die, that's a purposeless life, and it's very sad. The most purposeful life around is the Christian life, and we didn't get a chance to ask your bullet questions, but there's a book called The Chance or the Dance, and I would encourage people to get that book. It's a little small book, Chance or the Dance by Thomas Howard. Christians should be the most joyful people in the world. I don't always see that, and it worries me when I don't. And circumstances occur that can affect our lives, and I get that. But on the whole, there should be no one more joyful than Christians, and Paul tells us that. We are to be joyful and joyous and not drab and melancholy and sad, because we're preparing for something a whole lot more special than we have on this earth.
Okay. Well, you just answered the first one, so we're going to shoot through the last three, and then we'll get out of here. The next one was if you had a interesting quote or scripture you've been thinking a lot about recently.
I do. There's a bunch of quotes in my book, so I could have used any number of them. One that is related, if you don't mind, let me put my glasses on. But years ago, Einstein once said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, coming from one of the brightest men of the 20th century to ever walk. And there's a corollary quote to that, and it occurs in our Bible. And I think it's very similar to that. And it occurs in Proverbs 25, verse 2. It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search them out. I think it's getting back to that image of God thing. It's a glory of God to hide things. And mankind knows a lot more now than we did before, but we still got a lot more to learn. But when he says the glory of kings, substitutes kings for scientists. It's the glory of scientists to search those things out.
All right. So scientists are kings now.
Well, I mean, they didn't use the word scientist in the Old Testament.
Right. Okay. What is something you believe that many people don't?
I don't know if that many people don't believe it, but maybe they haven't thought about it. And if you read my first book, we talk about it in that book, and we talk about it in this book. And that is the concept that time is not absolute. That is a hard thing to grasp. I've mentioned that to people before, and they go, "No, I can't buy that. I can't buy that." But time is regional. It's different depending on the speed of light, the speed you're traveling, the altitude you're in. Those experiments have been proven over and over again. And that is one thing that I do believe is true. Most people probably hadn't thought about it, or if they do, they may not believe it's true. But it comes as a part of relativity theory, and that is that time is not absolute. It moves at a different pace, and that's not science fiction. And it doesn't have to do with the way clocks work. It has to do with the way time works. I mentioned years ago when I wrote my first book that time had a beginning. An evangelist that I know very well had never thought about that. I said, well, the Bible says that time has a beginning. There are verses that say that, but time is absolute. And some of the questions that I think that permeate our minds today, you mentioned age of the earth and so forth, have to do with that very idea of absolute time. And I'm not advocating the age theory where there's gaps in time and so forth, but yet there's still that idea of relativistic time. And when God created the earth, he was working on a time frame different from ours. It was a relativistic time and not earth time, because the earth hadn't even been created yet. Time had, but the earth hadn't yet. So that's one thing I do believe, and I'm still working out some of those ideas in my own mind, but I do believe that time is not absolute.
Okay. That's the next book.
It's regional.
Okay. All right. So if there was one piece of wisdom that you could leave behind, I was checking your Facebook. I know you're married to Cherry, but you also have kids and grandkids, I assume.
Three children, three daughter-in-laws, because all my children are boys, and 9 grandchildren.
Okay. So if there's one piece of wisdom that you could leave behind for your family, what would that be?
I would go to the scripture, and I would go to actually 2 verses, if you'll indulge me. And sure. I would use Ephesians 5:16, where Paul tells the Ephesians there to see that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. That idea of redeeming time is we're only here for a short period of time. We need to redeem it. When he says the days are evil, I think that's what Paul's meaning by that, is we're not going to be here for very long. And then James more or less reiterates that in James 4, verses 14 through 15. What is your life? Is it not even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away? And then later on in verse 15, he says, what should we, when we're doing things, he says, we should do as the Lord wills. Now, some have taken that verse out of context and says that every little thing that we do is because the Lord wills it. I don't believe that. I don't believe I got a good parking spot at the shopping center because God willed that. That's not what that verse is saying. What that verse is saying is we don't know how long we're going to be here. And so to make plans for the future is fine, but don't make those plans without remembering God and that he could take your life at any time. If I had advice, and I do have advice for my children and grandchildren, it would be those two things: to walk circumspectly and to redeem the times. But redeeming the time means also to be happy on this earth. There's nothing wrong with being happy, enjoying your wife or your husband or your children or your grandchildren or other things that are right in and of themselves. But we need to understand that we're only here a little time. James calls it like a vapor that appears and then vanishes. And that time can end at any time for all of us. Those are the things I would recommend to my children and grandchildren and daughter-in-laws.
Yeah, that's good. This has all
Thank
been
you.
good. If someone wants to get in contact with you, of course, the book is out now. It's been out for a couple of months. You can find it. Well, where can you find the book, and how can
Well,
someone get in
Amazon.com,
touch with you?
BarnesandNobles.com. There's any number of sites. Even if you just Google Bo Kirkwood, it'll probably pop up. But especially if you put in my book, it's called A Purpose-Driven God. I hope you don't mind me showing this.
No,
That's
go
what the
ahead.
cover will look like when you get it. A Purpose-Driven God. But BarnesandNobles.com will have it. Amazon.com will have it. And contacting me, I have no problems with giving. I don't have much of a social media. I do have a Facebook, as you know. That's how you contacted me. But
Yeah.
I don't have a website or anything like that. But you can go to BoKirkwood at AOL.com. That's my email. BoKirkwood at AOL.com. And if you do contact me and you wish to talk to me, then I'll send you my cell phone number. I'm not going to send that out over this podcast. But if you have the interest enough to contact me through my email and want to discuss anything privately, one-on-one, I will be more than happy to send you my email and love to talk to you. In case you haven't been able to tell, I'm passionate about these things. I love talking about him, and we have only scratched the surface of my book, really. So I would encourage people. I'm not here to make money on the book. I told you what the purpose of that book was for. If it causes one person to think about their life and give their life to Christ, it's been worth every minute it took me to write it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I know other people will benefit from it as well. Anything else that you'd like to say to the people before we get off?
No, I think for the time being, we have covered a wide range of topics.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate Dr. Bo Kirkwood for coming on today on the show. Uh, this is the part where I would tell people to subscribe to the channel or comment, especially if you disagree today. There's
Yes,
a lot of science stuff. Please disagree, and we can
yes.
hash it out in the comments, or email Bo Kirkwood, BOKIRKWOOD at AOL.com.
Old email,
He
yeah.
responds really fast on Facebook Messenger too. So reach out, please, to me or to him if you're disagreeing with any of the stuff we talked about today.
And
But that's it for the today's show. Go ahead.
I'm more than happy also if there's congregations that would like to get a series of lessons on these things. I'm happy to do that time willing for me to be able to do that sort of thing. But I'm willing to do that sort of thing too.
Yeah.
But YouTube is easy to do as well as is these podcasts.
All right. Well,
All right,
that's it for
thank you.
today's show. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.